surprising that I have to visit your National Library today. Our swim first, Buck Mulligan said. He turned to Stephen and asked blandly, Is this the day for your monthly wash, Kinch? Then he says to Haines, The unclean bard makes a point of washing once a month. All Ireland is washed by the Gulf Stream, Stephen said, as he let honey trickle over a slice of the loaf. Haines, from the corner where he was knotting easily a scarf about the loose collar of his tennis shirt, spoke, I intend to make a collection of your sayings, if you will let me. Speaking to me. They wash and tub and scrub. A gunbite of inwit. Conscience. Yet, here's a spot. That one about the cracked looking-glass of a servant being the symbol of Irish art is deuced good. Buck Mulligan kicked Stephen's foot under the table and said, with warmth of tone, Wait till you hear 'em on Hamlet, Haines. Well, I mean it, Haines said, still speaking to Stephen. I was just thinking of it when that poor old creature came in. Would I make any money by it? Stephen asked. Haines laughed and, as he took his soft grey hat from the holdfast of the hammock, said, I don't know, I'm sure. He strolled out to the doorway. Buck Mulligan bent across Stephen and said with coarse vigour, You put your hoof in it now. What did you say that for? Well, Stephen said, the problem is to get money. From whom? From the milkwoman or from him? It's a toss-up, I think. I blow him out about you, Buck Mulligan said, and then you come along with your lousy leer and your gloomy Jesuit jibes. I see little hope, Stephen said, from her or from him. Buck Mulligan sighed tragically and laid his hand on Stephen's arm. From me, Kinch, he said. In a suddenly changed tone he added, To tell you the God's truth, I think you're right. Damn all else they are good for. Why don't you play them as I do? To hell with them all. Let us get out of the kip. He stood up, gravely ungirdled and disrobed himself of his gown, saying resignedly, Mulligan is stripped of his garments. He emptied his pockets on the table. There's your snot-rag, he said. And putting on his stiff collar and rebellious tie, he spoke to them, chiding them, and to his dangling watch-chain. His hands plunged and rummaged in his trunk while he called for a clean handkerchief. God, we'll simply have to dress the character. I want puce gloves and green boots. Contradiction. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. Mercurial Malachi. A limp black missile flew out of his talking hands. There's your Latin Quarter hat, he said. Stephen picked it up and put it on. Haines called to them from the doorway. Are you coming, you fellows? I'm ready, Buck Mulligan answered, going towards the door. Come out, Kinch. You've eaten all we have left, I suppose. Resigned, he passed out with grave words and gait, saying, well nigh with sorrow, And going forth he met Butterly. Stephen, taking his ashplant from its leaning-place, followed them out, and as they went down the ladder, pulled to the slow iron door and locked it. He put the huge key in his inner pocket. At the foot of the ladder, Buck Mulligan said, Did you bring the key? I have it, Stephen said, preceding them. He walked on. Behind them he heard Buck Mulligan club with his heavy bath-towel the leader shoots of ferns or grasses. Down, sir! How dare you, sir? Haines asked, Do you pay rent for this tower? 12 quid, Buck Mulligan said. To the Secretary of State for War, Stephen added over his shoulder. They halted while Haines surveyed the tower and said at last, Rather bleak in winter-time, I should say. Martello, you call it? Billy Pitt had them built, Buck Mulligan said, when the French were on the sea, but ours is the Omphalos. What is your idea of Hamlet? Haines asked Stephen. Oh, no, Buck Mulligan shouted in pain. I am not equal to Thomas Aquinas and the 55 reasons he has made out to prop it up. Wait till I've had a few pints in me first. He turned to Stephen, saying, as he pulled down neatly the peaks of his primrose waistcoat, You couldn't manage it under 3 pints, Kinch, could you? It has waited so long, Stephen said listlessly. It can wait longer. You pique my curiosity, Haines said amiably. Is it some paradox? Pooh, Buck Mulligan said. We've grown out of wild and paradoxes. It's quite simple. He proves by algebra that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. What? Haines said, beginning to point at Stephen. He himself? Buck Mulligan slung his towel stolewise round his neck and, bending in loose laughter, said to Stephen's ears, "O shade of Kinch the elder! Japhet in search of a father!" "We're always tired in the morning," Stephen said to Haines, "and it is rather long to tell." Buck Mulligan, walking forward, raised his hands. "The sacred pint alone can unbind the tongue of Daedalus," he said. "I mean to say," Haines explained to Stephen as they followed, "this tower and these cliffs here remind me somehow of Elsinore. That beetles o'er his base into the sea, isn't it?" Buck Mulligan turned suddenly for an instant towards Stephen, but did not speak. In the bright silent instant Stephen saw his own image in cheap dusty mourning between their gay attires. "It's a wonderful tale," Haines said, bringing them to halt again. Eyes pale as the sea, the wind had freshened. Paler, firm and prudent, the sea's ruler, he gazed southward over the bay, empty except for the smoke plume of the mailboat vague on the bright skyline and a sail tacking by the Muglins. "I read a theological interpretation of it somewhere," he said, bemused. "The father and the son idea, the son striving to be atoned with the father." Buck Mulligan at once put on a blithe, broadly smiling face. He looked at them, his well-shaped mouth open happily, his eyes, from which he had suddenly withdrawn all shrewd sense, blinking with mad gaiety. He moved a doll's head to and fro, the brims of his Panama hat quivering, and began to chant in a quiet, happy, foolish voice. "I am the queerest young fellow that you have heard. My mother's a Jew, my father's a bird. With Joseph the joiner I cannot agree, so here's to disciples and cavalry." He held up a forefinger of warning. "And if anyone thinks that I'm not divine, he'll get no free drinks when I'm making the wine, but have to drink water and wish it were plain that I make when the wine becomes water again." He tugged swiftly at Stephen's ashplant in farewell and, running forward to a brow of the cliff, fluttered his hands at his sides like fins or wings of one about to rise in the air and chanted, "Goodbye now, goodbye. Write down all I said and tell Tom, Dick and Harry I rose from the dead. What's bred in the bone cannot fail me to fly, and Olivet's breezy. Goodbye now, goodbye." He capered before them, down towards the 40-foot hole, fluttering his wing-like hands, leaping nimbly, Mercury's hat quivering in the fresh wind that bore back to them his brief bird-sweet cries. Haines, who had been laughing guardedly, walked on beside Stephen and said, "We oughtn't to laugh, I suppose. He's rather blasphemous. I'm not a believer myself, that is to say. Still, his gaiety takes the harm out of it somehow, doesn't it? What did he call it? Joseph the joiner?" "The Ballad of Joking Jesus," Stephen answered. "Oh," Haines said, "you've heard it before?" "3 times a day, after meals," Stephen said drily. "You're not a believer, are you?" Haines asked. "I mean a believer in the narrow sense of the word, creation from nothing and miracles and a personal God." "There's only one sense of the word, it seems to me," Stephen said. Haines stopped to take out a smooth silver case in which twinkled a green stone. He sprang it open with his thumb and offered it. "Thank you," Stephen said, taking a cigarette. Haines helped himself and snapped the case to. He put it back in his side pocket and took from his waistcoat pocket a nickel tinderbox, sprang it open too, and, having lit his cigarette, held the flaming spunk towards Stephen in the shell of his hands. "Yes, of course," he said, as they went on again. "Either you believe or you don't, isn't it? Personally, I couldn't stomach that idea of a personal God. You don't stand for that, I suppose?" "You behold in me," Stephen said with grim displeasure, "a horrible example of free thought." He walked on, waiting to be spoken to, trailing his ashplant by his side. Its ferrule followed lightly on the path, squealing at his heels, my familiar after me, calling "Stephen." A wavering line along the path. They will walk on it tonight, coming here in the dark. He wants that key. It is mine. I paid the rent. Now I eat his salt bread. Give him the key too. All. He will ask for it. That was in his eyes. "After all," Haines began. Stephen turned